So I wanted to welcome you to the evening keynote talk of the Translation Theory Today conference. I'm welcoming you on behalf of my fellow co-organizers, Jin Chang, Michael Healy, and Sarah Salman. Edwin Frank, thank you for being with us. This conference is being given by the Critical Theory Certificate Program and the Center for the Humanities, and it is actually the 5th annual Critical Theory Conference. I remember starting this conference back in 2012, and we very optimistically called it the first annual Critical Theory Conference, hoping to make it an annual event. So I'm delighted to be here tonight on our 5th conference, and it is also our largest ever Critical Theory Conference. We have 85 presentations, and our scholars are from all walks of life and from all career paths, from practicing translators to editors and publishers, to Ph.D. students and candidates, to full-time faculty. So thank you all for being here. You've come from all over the United States and Canada, as well as Europe and Asia. Some of you have traveled very far to be here with us over the course of these 2 days. And you know, it's truly due to your interest that these conferences are a success. So we thank you all for being here, and we look forward to the next day of discourse as well. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to someone whose guidance and support makes not only conferences like this possible, but initiatives like the Critical Theory Certificate Program possible as well. We are a new program. We were just ratified in fall of 2014. He is the coordinator of the Critical Theory Certificate Program. He is also the director of the Center for the Humanities, the director of the Writers Institute, a distinguished professor of comparative literature, and a noted author and essayist. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Andre Aciman.
Okay, now I've been condemned. Actually, it's made me very, very happy to see so many of you come in today, and I hope many more tomorrow as well as we do this 2-day event. It takes a lot of work, for those of you who don't know this, to put together a 2-day conference with people coming from literally all over the world. And I mean, we owe everything to Claire because she manages things, but she also creates them, thinks them through, and usually leaves no stone unturned. So we're very happy with this. This is, again, to celebrate the Critical Certificate Program. We created that, the Critical Theory Certificate Program. It's very complicated to say. I'm still not used to say. We've been doing this for, actually, informally for almost 5 years, but formally for 2-3 years. We created this for really 2 reasons. Our students need critical theory in 2 ways. On one hand, they use the critical theory that they acquire, that they learn, that they practice in order to write better dissertations and to become better scholars and academicians. At the same time, it also helps them when they produce their Ph.D. as well as a certificate in critical theory. It helps them in the job market. So we've created this with 2 visions in mind, and I think it's been working very well. The first person who graduated with the certificate and the Ph.D. got a job right away, and I think we had something to do with it. I'd like to think that. To celebrate this program, what we do is we have a 2-day annual fest, basically. For us, it's really a wonderful moment when we bring together and we choose a topic every year that's different, but that engages critical theory in one way or another. And tomorrow we're going to have Homi Bhabha come and discuss his view of what translation is. And we will discuss translation in that respect. And you've all been doing, those of you who have participated and have given papers today or tomorrow, you all have a different view of what a translation is. And we can discuss that at some other time. Today, however, we hope to have a very practical response to what translation is. Not necessarily translation theory, though I think that all translation is in form, one way or another, a theory, or at least a manifestation of a particular theory. But today, it's a very practical and extremely successful translation venture that our guest tonight has. Edwin Frank has for many years now been the editor-in-chief of what used to be called, or I used to call it, New York Review of Books. Now they've become New York Review of Book Classics, which makes more sense, of course. But I asked him today, the last I heard there were 300 books that they had published. Most of them are translations, not all of them are, but a very heavy number are. And Edwin basically does something that Penguin has never done and doesn't seem able to ever do and may never be able to do. He simply goes there and finds books, I think, that you like. But it's very difficult. You can understand right away why he's publishing this obscure 19th century Russian novel that nobody ever reads. It's on no list. Certainly no graduate student is asked to read it. And yet there they are, not just one book, but the whole opus of this person. I don't know how many copies you sell, but it's all done so brilliantly and so well that actually we're very lucky not only to have him in the business, but particularly to have him tonight with us. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks, Andre, and thank you all for coming. I actually decided not to talk about how we go about selecting the books, though some of you will have heard me give my usual answer, which is rigorously by whim. And I have to say, they're not all books I like. A lot of them are books I like. Some of them are books I like to hate. But, you know, a really hateable book is also an estimable book. I think this will be perhaps my only theoretical reference. Heidegger says somewhere in his Nietzsche book, hatred too can grant premeditation and vision. But, without any more ado, I was flattered and not a little flustered when Andre called me to propose that I deliver a keynote speech to a conference on translation and theory. I was also, I have to confess, wondering and a little wary. After all, I'm not a translator, and I'm not a theorist, I'm not a scholar. It's true that I spent more time than I would like to admit in graduate school studying art history, but my accomplishments over that too long time were, like those of Machado de Assis's posthumous hero Brás Cubas, entirely negative. One of them was never to attend an academic conference. I can't say I know what a keynote speech is, except that I seem to be delivering one. I mumbled as much to Andre, who responded characteristically, "So much the better." I should have asked him why, but of course I failed to. We were playing our own game of cat and mouse, and I was too quickly caught. Though now that I'm up here delivering, I know not what, I would like to remind Andre and you all that it is all his fault. In any case, I must have thought, I think I thought, that as I do publish translations and work in various capacities with translators, I ought to have some thoughts about the character and import of that work, and thoughts, after all, are somewhere on the way to theory. There must be some principles informing what I do, and this was a chance to define what they were, because though now doubt's great maw began to gape, surely I did have them. Yes, it certainly would be interesting to know what they were, to me, I thought, perhaps even to others. Unfortunately, in the months that followed, the wished-for illumination did not take place. No principle declared itself, nothing but a growing urgency became clear. Hoping for illumination, I had recourse to the literature, mostly unfamiliar to me, though of course I knew it was extensive and ever more so. And there I found many fascinating observations about the differences between languages and how translators had sought to surmount the problems and paradoxes they gave rise to. I also encountered the growing body of work devoted to measuring translations against originals and in relation to each other, an important project, though worrisomely prone to fault-finding. Sometimes behind it I heard the circular grinding of the old saw, tradutore, traditore. Then there were the ruminations on translation itself, the babble of Babel, which were subject to the usual obfuscations that attend the idea itself. Millennia after Plato made it clear that the only way to grasp the nettle was to kick the bucket. Philosophy is the study of death. Admiring as I was of much of this work, skeptical as I was of some of it, I knew I could not add to it. The only thing I was going to be able to do was, effectively, to make a public spectacle of myself by creeping back into my cave and chaining myself up with the fire and the shadows. The only thing to do was to describe the things that, as an editor of translations, I do. What do I do? No, I think I will start by putting that question off and saying something about how I came to have something to do with translation. Of course, almost as far back as I can remember, I have read work in translation. And when I was growing up, the mysterious figures of Constance Garnett and Scott Moncrief and Edward Seidensticker were inseparable from Tolstoy, Proust, and Tanizaki as I knew them. I have to say, though, that I didn't devote much thought to what those books being translated, entailed. I suppose that my first sense of the difference translations could make came when I read Nabokov's comments about Dostoevsky being a rotten writer and a wretched stylist. This was plainly wrong. Dostoevsky was a very great writer, and Nabokov's sniping only made a rather small writer smaller. But given the incessant clamor that courses through Dostoevsky's novels, the constant yelling and yammering and vowing and confessing and threatening and explaining that goes on in them, I could imagine what lay behind Nabokov's remark, and it was an interesting thought that a great writer could be in some measure a thoroughly lousy writer. I wanted to get the real feel of this badness, which must, I figured, be veiled by translation. Bakhtin's praise of Dostoevsky's polyphony also gestured at this cacophony, and I remember how excited I was in the early 80s when Richard Pevere and, I can't remember her first name, Volokhonsky, promised to restore the racket. But all this was when I was a mere reader, before I found myself, many years later as it happened, and without any real preparation, it has to be said, an editor at NYRB with a translation to edit. That I had one was almost as unlikely as that I was there to edit it. I had run into Richard Sieberth, whose translations of Hölderlin and Maurice Sèvres I really admire, at a cocktail party, and somehow the conversation had come round to the autobiographical novels of the communard Jules Vallès. The first of them, L'Enfant, the child, was, Richard said, quite wonderful, bitter, but also very funny. One of the funniest books in French, he said, not, he added, that it had much competition. It should be translated, he said. Well, I went back to the office and after hunting around, discovered that surprisingly, sometime in the next year, a translation of The Child was due out from Monash University in Australia. Douglas Parme had done it, and so I got in touch with Monash and Parme, a very interesting, clever, irreverent man who'd put his linguistic talents at the service of the British Secret Service in World War II. One of the Cambridge spies was the best man at his wedding, and had taught for years at Oxford and translated various novels, Effie Briest, some from Fondan, from French and German. He also did the great racist, what's his name? French novelist from the 19th century, Les Pléiades. Gobineau, yeah. Anyway, translated various novels from French and German before retiring to Western Australia in his 90s to drink wine and translate at leisure. Douglas sent me his translation of the book, and Monash was open to a joint publication, and I read it and it was very good, very alive, though there was perhaps a slight problem about the slang in it. Here I should say that the hero of the novel is the son of a schoolmaster, and schoolyard slang plays a big part in the book, which is, among other things, a battle of correct and incorrect vocabularies. Well, the book was written in the 19th century in French, of course, and Douglas was English and over 90, and I was American and younger. And I said I thought we might have to make some adjustments for the slang not to sound more like Martian than anything else. And he agreed that made some sense. But before I knew it, the book was due to be published, and I had hardly begun to grapple with the slang. So I started in, and very quickly I realized that the question of schoolyard slang, a big enough question in its own right, what is the sound of century-old French schoolyard slang in English? Well, that the question of schoolyard slang was not simply a question of schoolyard slang. What was said in the schoolyard affected what was said in the classroom, and what was said round the family table, and so on. And all these multiplying things had a bearing on the narrative voice, and for that matter, on the things that went unsaid, too. They were all related. They were all entangled. The problem was not one of simply replacing archaic words with more or less current words, or almost current words, or British words with American words, I realized with growing alarm as I read and marked up the translation. The question was not local or specific in the least. It seemed, in fact, bottomless. And so I worked away with growing desperation on Douglas's very good text. Even its goodness had become part of the problem, with the original also in hand until the book was very late indeed. And other people who are translators here who have worked with me have endured this, but not what's going to come. And now I looked at the book that I had gone through and marked up, and I thought about how much more time it would take to send it to Australia for review. And I grew afraid of the wait, and for that matter, of what Douglas might say. And if the book was ever to get out, if I was ever to get free of it, because it had been consuming my days, it seemed to me there was only one thing to do. Without sending the book to Douglas, I sent the book to the printer. There may have been a moment of relief before I said to myself, what have I done? After which the days began to pass and my guilt began to grow until at last the printed book came in. I sent it, I don't know with what kind of mumbling note, to Douglas. Days passed again before a letter arrived from Australia. I had no idea, it began, that the American language was so different from English. I'm telling this story, among other reasons, so that you will see why I've been invited into your fold. If you're a translator and if you're a writer, you will recognize me now, what you've always suspected, known the editor to be, which is your enemy. I never knew how different the American language was from the English language, Parme wrote, and proceeded to give a rather long list of the notable differences between the two tongues before adding, job well done. I felt relief, and then I felt the irony. I like to think he was not just being ironic. We did work together again. But of course the job had not been well done. I tell this story as the enemy, but also, like the ancient mariner, as a penance, though I wonder if I would dare to if Douglas had not let me just a little bit off the hook. I tell it as an example, too, of how the job of editing should not, of course, be done, but also, without excusing myself, of how things, translations, do get done. It is natural enough to see an object as an intentional object, but the English translation of Jules Valles's The Child exists not only at a significant, perhaps unbridgeable remove from the intentions of the maker of L'Enfant. It was itself a product of an unanticipated encounter at a cocktail party, an unspecified agreement between translator and editor, editorial inexperience, time pressure and panic, thoroughly unprofessional behavior, and a certain forbearance. The book, in other words, is a conjunction of contingencies, as much accident and as act. And yet, that is The Child. That's how I came to do what I do, and now I suppose it would be just as well to say a little more about what it is I now do, how I go about editing a translation, now that I hope I do things a little bit better than I did. I'm not going to talk about the business of choosing what to translate for publication, though that is, of course, an interesting subject and a touchy one, if only because so few are chosen. Still, that seems too big and complicated a subject to consider here, and I'm going to stick with the specifics of the relationship between editor and translator, a relationship that I began by so woefully abusing. The book is chosen, the translation is done. What is the editor to do? The translation exists, first of all, as a relation between the translator and the original text and the language of the original text, and inevitably it will and should bear traces of that. Some of these are, you could say, elemental things. For example, I've had translations from the Russian come in with a lot of continuous tenses, is goings and was comings. Not knowing Russian, I'm not sure why. Littering the pages with the jingling ing ending that so bedevils English. In French, people do not do things so much as seem to do things, even though, in fact, what they seem to do, they do. German has a hankering after hendiadys, doubling up almost identical adjectives for emphasis, which can make for a long slog in English. Chinese handles tense differently from English, and continuity can prove surprisingly problematic. And of course, different languages not only have their characteristic tics and rhetorical tricks, but also a range of different ones across their literary and linguistic histories. Whether or not to retain or adjust or make substitutions for such features, some specific to an author or book, some generic to a language, To what degree they inform or give form, they provide information or give form to the book. These have been the translator's problems, and now that the translation is in my hands, I have to try to make them mine. This means reading not with some idea of a pre-existing norm that has to be imposed on the book to make it a book in English to be read by Americans, but looking instead for what makes the book, at some level, because all the levels it can't be found, imaginatively present. Sometimes that involves questions of what the reader may or may not be presumed to know or be able to envision about another time or place. But mostly it is a question of the words on the page. Do they have a character of their own that seems to give the book a character of its own in English? Do they hold the attention in a way that is comparable to that of the original, or what, if I don't know the language, I imagine the translation to be evoking? What makes you, that makes, as I say here again, that makes you imagine the original? This question is omnipresent and in a sense unending. That's what I discovered in my panic over the slang of the child. And being able to keep that question in mind and give it a kind of bodily form so that the reader of the translation will ultimately be thinking, is this the way the writer sees things? Oh yes, look how he sees things. That, it seems to me, is the trick that we want to pull off. Another way of saying it is that the translator finds a certain tone which functions as a kind of ongoing background signal of the book as a whole. That's what marks the difference between a good translation and a bad one. A good translation has found a sound for the sense that the translated book makes, and it is to that sound that the editor gratefully responds. As to a bad translation, well, there are those that have a tone that for some reason seems the wrong tone. Worst of all, however, are those translations which have no tone, in which you don't hear words so much as nothing but words. A good translation, one that finds the tone of the book, may still require a good deal of editing. And the editor who sets about it has to worry about hearing the book and hearing what the translator makes of the book at the same time, and asking now and then, is this really what the book is like? And then again, does this really sound like the translator of the book? Has the translator sort of lost his or her voice for a moment? The editor also has to think about the characters in the book, who after all have a certain independent existence of their own, as well as the different kinds of address that the book may contain. Have these been given proper, palpable independence in the translation? The editor's job is, in my view, not just to raise these questions, but also to float some proposals about how to address them, not least because that helps to make the questions clearer, and of course it may make clear that they are entirely the wrong questions. At the same time, always, the editor has to be on guard against his own desire to make a mark. You have to ask, have I succumbed to shifting things around reflexively because language allows for such shifts? Have I fallen in love with my pencil? In any case, with such questions in mind, I make my way from one end to the other of the book, word by word, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, an order of verbal objects that are in some sense decreasingly malleable as you go along. And it is a curious fact that by the end, though I may have the acutest memory of a given word or sentence encountered along the way, especially a troublesome one, I often have only the vaguest sense of what actually happened in the book. Should one begin by reading the book as a whole and then making a whole plan to address such problems as there may be? In theory, it would seem yes, but in practice, I have never been able to do it, and other editors say the same thing, and I think translators usually proceed in the same way. In any case, when I'm done, I send the pages, a mixture of suggestions and questions in my hopeless handwriting, to the poor translator for consideration, making it clear, however, that I hope the questions and suggestions make some sense, but I'm certainly not looking for the translator to adopt them or even to respond to them one by one. I just want a new draft with whatever changes the translator sees fit to make. I prefer that for that draft to have no indication of its relation to the previous one. I hate track changes because I don't want to get into an argument about the details. Those are the translator's business. I do my best to read the new draft in its own right as a new thing, going through the original process of consideration again. And so, step by step, the business of translation and the edit of translation arrives at a satisfactory or more or less satisfactory result, or everybody gets exhausted, but we hope it works out. And it's a process that in a way reminds me of making, it's an old-fashioned process that reminds me of making a photographic print from a negative, slowly uncovering certain details, or indeed obscuring them, defining and refining the play of figures and light and dark around them until the whole picture is present. The original work has come into its own by becoming the translator's work, and perhaps even the enemy had his role. This is a bit of a ramble, and I might as well end by rambling out. Someone, somewhere in Esther Allen and Susan Bernofsky's excellent anthology of translators writing on translation, proposes that translation, the translation of literature at least, be considered not so much as a problem of exchanging different linguistic currencies as a literary genre in its own right, and of course a very ancient one too. This seems to be about right. Translation, like any literary genre, is a distinctive way of writing with a number of conventions it must observe to be recognizable as such. The translation exists in relation to an original work in another language that the translator claims sufficient familiarity with, both the work and the language. The translation seeks to convey some, as much as possible, you might say, but that might well be overstating things. In translation, everything is a matter of degree, but convey some of the content, but also of the character of the work in another language, with which, again, the translator claims sufficient familiarity. The translation will, because it is in another language, also lose some of the content and character of the original, and, if it is a successful instance of the genre, it will add some of its own. The translation is a work of art which takes its bearing from another work of art from which it then takes its distance. Two rather odd things tend to follow from this. One is that, because a translation always loses something of the original, there is always another translation to be made, though in practice, the differences may be trivial. Translations are replaceable and disposable, and if this seems to set them apart from originals, think again that the vast majority of original works of art are not only forgettable, but designed to be forgettable, the better to be replaced with other forgettable works of art. So how much difference is there? The other thing is that translations do not seem to invite or bear translation themselves, unless they're summoned to fill in, I should say, for a lost or otherwise inaccessible original. This is true even when a translation assumes, as translations can, the status of a canonical work of art within its own language. Pope's Iliad, Hölderlin's Antigone do not mean much outside of their native linguistic matrix. So in such cases, the translation, seemingly a derivative product, proves singular in a way that the original isn't. Problems and paradoxes and curious conundrums of the sort that, as I said, exist early on, exist on the horizon of the practical business that I've also tried to shine a light on. What the translation and the original share, finally, are words, though mostly not the same words and not in the same order, and the properties of words, above all the property of referentiality, which means that words are always available to replace other words. As a genre of literature, translation is specially adapted to that interspace, but all literature inhabits it and indeed could not exist without it. Scenes, speeches, lines, metaphors, words can be added or dropped from Shakespeare, and Shakespeare will remain Shakespeare. So again, it's a question of degree. Poems do remain poems in paraphrase. Translation proves it. Language is a system of differences, an identity and ordinary mystery, like a cloud of gnats. Though it may make a difference, it's true whether you're inside the cloud or not, and whether you are human or gnat. In any case, somewhere in and around it, translation is going on. Thanks.
Will you take questions? Sure. Questions. Oh, by the way, questions are not disquisitions. They are questions. Well, thank you for answering all our questions.
It's very good.
No, you're not going away yet. No. for the question. Any thoughts? Yes, sir.
I was just wondering if you know the original language for which text do you actually consult the original in your editing? Yes, on a kind of spot check basis. When I find a crux, something that doesn't seem clear, then I will. And sometimes when a sentence just seems hopelessly unserviceable in English, to go back to the original, even if it makes perfect sense, can suggest a different way of perhaps attacking it. So, I mean, I just been working on a translation with Esther Allen of a Spanish book, Zama, by Antonio Di Benedetto, which, I mean, it's a heroic feat of translation on Esther's part because it's a modernist book from the 50s, a post-Dostoevsky, post-Kafkian book, which, however, is set in the late 18th century in Asunción in Paraguay. And so the hero, who is sort of a modern isolado, is also a very stiff, very sexually frustrated 18th century imaginary Spaniard, because though he's actually an Americano, but he thinks of himself as really being Spaniard, even though he's never been there. And so striking this balance between a kind of archaism and a kind of modernism and a modernist archaism and was really, really difficult. And then you add to it the proclivity of Latin languages for Latinate words, and the fact that in English those words behave rather differently from the way they behave in Latin languages. You had a whole series of things to balance and so on. And I found myself first consulting, it's tough Spanish. We worked on it a long time. By the end, I think my Spanish had gotten a good deal better. But at first I was consulting the French translation more than the Spanish, but the French translation really had taken a lot of liberties. I mean, it was sort of, it was kind of rewritten. So then going back to the Spanish, and we figured it out. And it's good, I think. Yeah.
To follow up on that question, if you find a sentence in the English language manuscript that is not clear,
Yeah.
as you said, and consult the other language and find out that it's not clear
In the other language.
as editor, what's your strategy?
Yeah, well, this is always tricky, the question of whether you improve on the translation. Obviously, in certain cases, you mustn't, and in some cases, perhaps you may. I'll give a cheap but funny example of a case of not doing it, where the translator proposed doing it, which is a novel by Simenon, 3 Bedrooms in Manhattan, where a couple have they have a one-night stand that turns into a lifelong nightmare. Yeah, right. Yeah. And along the way, they decide that they need to. Across from the apartment where they meet in Greenwich Village, there is a quote-unquote little Jewish tailor who sits on a table with a bare light bulb over him and sews. And they look out the window and they think, this is our mascot. This is his presence has been what has brought us together for this wonderful, not so wonderful thing. And we really must do something to show our appreciation. So they send him a lobster dinner. Now, I mean, this is this wonderful episode where you can imagine the other novel, I mean, about the Jewish emigre in New York. And the translator said to me, well, clearly Simenon didn't know about kosher rules. Shouldn't we? And I said, no, we have to leave this in. It's too good. Just as later in the novel, they walk over the Brooklyn Bridge to get to LaGuardia. Anyway. So there, I mean, it just seemed to be textually. But there were cases in Zama where this man uses a really, really roundabout sort of vocabulary and is constantly kind of loading the landscape around him with his kind of repressed sexual fantasies, which are at the same time kind of oozing out of his every stiff, starchy word. Where it's very hard to see, it is not exactly clear what is being said, where idea and seen thing begin and end. And obviously, I think that has to be preserved. What you want to then preserve is something of that You want the confusion to feel charged in some way, because I think it is in that book, charged, but you don't want to clear it up.
Well, I have a question, because sometime I was reading recently the English translation of one of Elena Ferrante's earlier novels, just to prove why I hated it so much. So I'm the only one who hates Elena Ferrante.
No.
Anyway, I was reading it in English, and as you read, what's it, Leo Spitzer has this wonderful example. He says, as you keep reading an author, suddenly something clicks, and you pick up some kind of inflection that you know has a meaning, but you don't quite know what it is. So as I'm reading Elena Ferrante in English, I picked something up, and so I borrowed the copy of my colleague's Italian version, and I compared them, and she was right. She didn't translate it wrong. It's just that it was so flat. And I was wondering if you can say something about, sometimes the translator is just flat. It's not wrong, but it doesn't quite capture. And I wonder what it is that is missing.
Well, I mean, sometimes the original is, because another example I thought of before in answering the last question was Vasily Grossman, who we were speaking about before, who is, Russians will not say that Grossman is a great stylist, and he writes somewhat plodding sentences. And Robert Chandler, at a certain point, accused me of making Grossman a better writer than he is, and because I sort of economized. And this is a case where I think the sentences are in the service of a certain body of information and feeling, and making them slightly better written sentences communicating that is not a betrayal of what the book is seeking to, the effect the book is seeking to have on the reader. It would be a mistake to imagine, in fact, that the nature of the book is that the elaboration of the sentences is the true heart of the book. And therefore, you can make those sentences a little more functional, and that's okay. In the case of translations that just fall completely flat, well, I mean, I think bad translation is perhaps as much a mystery as good translation. I mean, it's this sort of, you just feel that the translator has not seen the thing. And yet, as I said, you don't hear words, you see nothing but words. And you get that kind of, people will submit that sort of translation. Often people actually whose original language is not English. And you have a crestfallen feeling as you look at this thing, because there's just almost nothing you can do to save it without some sense of the integument or whatever it is, that tone.
How do you find your translators? How do you select them? People propose books to you. Do you propose books to certain preferred translators? How does that work?
Chiefly now the latter, that translators come and bring stuff to us, or we've worked with a variety of translators in a number of languages for a while, and so there are people I can go to who one hopes aren't too busy and have time to take on a new job. But it becomes really problematic when you move into a new language. For example, I have it's very overdue now, a book that is to be translated from the Arabic. And part of the reason it's overdue is that it's not only from the Arabic, it's a Jewish writer from Iraq who left Iraq in the early 60s, but actually continued to write in Arabic. His name is suddenly escaping me. He never chose to write in Hebrew, even though but he also wrote in a kind of Baghdadi, a Jewish Baghdadi dialect. And I have no idea, of course, of Arabic. I have no idea of any Arabic, really. But I was told that you need to get somebody who has some knowledge of this, even though there are fewer and fewer people who have any knowledge of this, because there haven't been any Jews in Baghdad for more than 50 years. So it took quite a while to find somebody to take that on.
So if they did it with a Yiddish inflection in English, would that be a combination?
No, I think that's the example of the tone, the wrong tone kind of thing that you want. Yeah, yeah.
Sir, you had a question?
Yes, sir. You seem to work in a very utopian environment.
Mm-hmm.
From what I hear, in terms of selection, in terms of
Well, I mean, as the story I told, I mean, it is affected by it because, and I mean, you could, in the sense that you do have to get a book out at a certain point. And another thing to bear in mind, at one point I was thinking about, I mean, I did write a bit about the problem of choosing translations. Something to be borne in mind about any publishing program, at least any commercial publishing program, but probably it's going to be true of anything except the most fugitive avant-garde imprint, is that the chief thing a publisher has to keep doing is choosing something. You don't have a whole array, you know, there are only so many choices at a given moment, and you have to keep publishing books. So you have to choose something to publish, and you hope it's the best thing that is around. And in my case, I mean, I can rove back and forth across all of time and space, so in theory I should have nothing but good books. But, you know, then there's the scandal that it's me choosing them, so that can lead to mistakes too. And so on. So, I mean, those pressures are very much there. Other things, I mean, I don't know the whole range of things that Larry has in mind with that, but I mean, issues of sort of well, there's also the issues of, do you normalize the translation so it will sell well? I don't have to do that. I'm not, I mean, the normalization issue is, I mean, a translation always involves an accommodation of some sort, but the notion, I remember hearing the marketing director for Knopf saying when it came to doing Smilla's Sense of Snow or whatever it's called, they just hid the fact that it was a translation altogether because they thought they had a bestseller on their hands, and they did. But it's not, I mean, in fact, we very much go out of our way to do the opposite. This lady over here had her hand up a while ago.
Yeah, you used the phrase when a translator claims some degree of familiarity.
Uh-huh.
And I'm curious what you think about W.S. Merwin's selected poems, which goes back a very long way. But he made very clear in the preface that he was translating from a number of languages he did not know at all. And of course, he was using experts and
Yeah.
and poetry is quite different from prose. But what do you think?
Well, he pioneered that sort of, he and to some extent Bly, that business of you know, sort of getting somebody to do a trot and then you turn it into poetry. That was a sort of subgenre of translation, and I mean, there were some interesting successes of it, and in fact, we publish Merwin's translation of Mandelstam that he did with Clarence Brown, which is how I came to know Mandelstam's poems as a teenager, which still work on me. It's interesting, though, to look at those translations, which were very controversial, and Joseph Brodsky, you know, vilified them. They are translations which take Mandelstam and make him into a latter-day American imagist of the 1960s. Now, it's not really who Mandelstam exactly was, but it is a considerable poet, as in that book. I mean, that book certainly made an impression then, and I think continues to make an impression. On the other hand, over the years, and this, I mean, I think it was the issue of the historical development of translation. You kept hearing after that initial argument between Brodsky and Merwin that, I mean, then the translation of Mandelstam went two ways. There were the people who tried to put Mandelstam into tiny little metrical boxes, and those translations were painfully bad, partly because the prosodic resources are not the same in the two languages, and partly because, frankly, the prosodic resources of not that many American poets anymore possess real prosodic resources of that sort. And that went on for a long time, until maybe about 10 years ago, when what you'd keep hearing about Mandelstam is that there's sort of this kind of rustling inside the language. I think it's his phrase, the rustle language, where words suggest other words, and there's kind of a voice leading from one word to the next. There's sort of internal rhyme or internal sounds, and they're puns. And people kept being told that, and people began to find ways to begin to translate it. So in this case, we've just published a Mandelstam, which I think is very, very interesting, of the Voronezh notebooks, the last book that he did, by a guy, how translations come to be. This is a guy who lives totally off the grid. He makes homemade furniture, he makes sculptural furniture in Santa Fe, and he grew up as the son of an Episcopalian priest on an Indian reservation in Arizona. But he goes to Spain, He has a house in Spain, and there, 15 years ago or so, he encountered a Spanish translation of the Ronège notebooks, which he thought was just amazing. He'd never read such poetry. Then he looked at the English ones, and he thought, oh my God, what happened? And so he taught himself Russian over the last 15 years, and worked on the Mandelstam translation for the last 10 years. And finally, I mean, he had a note, he had sent me a letter in which he explained, it was a very good letter about all the problems with the existing translations. I thought, yeah, but what, I mean, the proof of the pudding is the eating. And then I said, but send me some of your translations. And there was this sort of, he had a line, Voronezh, Raven's Edge, these sorts of plays of words going on, very different from Merwin, and in some sense, a new poet coming to light. Yeah.
I wonder how you handle comedy, which is so contextual and sort of meant to produce an image, right? Just the last one. And I'm thinking about a translation of Aristophanes, where they seem to import all of the sort of style and rhythm of vaudeville,
Mm-hmm.
but it was very pragmatic and probably different originally, but
Mm-hmm.
it sort of worked because it has a sort of internal
Mm-hmm.
logic of comedy. So, I mean, do you bring in who your
I've never done a comic play. I mean, recently we did a book of very early Chekhov stories, which are basically complete, just humor pieces, really. And I remember reading it through first and thinking, this is not very funny. And we did with that book what I just described. And I picked it up more recently, and I thought, it's moderately funny. I mean, comedy it's in timing, and you try and find ways to get the timing. And actually, while you're there in the trenches, back and forth, sometimes the translator has a brilliant new way of framing it, and you think, great, we've got it. And sometimes you think, And of course, the fact is that when you have your nose pressed to the paper, at a certain point, your instincts are as unreliable as reliable. You just have to back off. But, there are some things. I mean, I'm not opposed to translate. You were saying the shtick, just adding shtick. In another Russian book we did, Paul Schmidt, who was a man of the theater as well as a translator, and an academic at Texas for years, but did a book called The Stray Dog Cabaret, where he did various translations of Akhmatova and Tsvetaeva. And the Stray Dog Cabaret was the cabaret where all these people gathered in Moscow. No, it was Leningrad, I think. Was it Leningrad or Moscow? I can't remember. So he basically made it into a kind of song and dance review. So you have Yesenin doing sort of country music things. I'm country kind of cowboy songs, and Mandelstam is doing drinking toasts. And they are they're true to the original at one level.
Yes. Thank you for this. I have two questions. You talked about the character of the original, and you also mentioned the true heart and function of the work. My first question is, are the character and the true heart and the function are the one thing? And my second question is, how to define the character of the original? Thank you.
So the character and what are one thing? What is the first?
The character and the true heart of the
Oh, the true heart. Well, I mean, I tend to have a slightly dualist tendency to think that books have, there's sort of form and there's content, which is obviously, form is only another form of content, and content is informed by the form it's presented in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, these things go round and round. But, so, I mean, in some books, as I was saying, like the Grossman book, it seems to me the content, the form is a form suitable for delivering that, for making that content which has to do with history and which has to do with certain historical events and certain moral questions, to make it as explicit as possible. So the form is not one of Baroque sentences where the sheer performance of the sentence is what you want to observe or capture. When it comes to figuring out the true character, that's sometimes, of course, a book that I suppose it starts with the fact that one is impressed by the book. Something about the book makes an impression on you, and whatever it is makes an impression on you is something where you are predisposed to say, that must be a real dimension of the book, and I'm going to look at the other parts of the book with that in mind, because that really struck me to begin with. The translator in turn may say, this is something I think is really happening in the book, and you may be guided by the translator's perception. The translators come to you and say, this is an amazing book of a certain kind, and so on, and you probably then you'll be predisposed to try and find that in the book. If you don't find it in the book, you may not publish it, because you say, whatever.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I still have a question about it because I do hear translators complaining about that.
Mm-hmm.
Often the editors seem to be using more conventional means of expression than what they as translators feel should be there. And I did see a number of translations from Czech to English, and there is a tendency to translate car as a fish.
Mm-hmm.
It does exist such a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you say that you don't feel engaging in any way, or
No, I would say I don't think normalization is what I hope I'm doing. I do think, as I said, there's always a question of accommodation between the two languages. And that's just unmistakable. It was, I find sometimes very frustrating this discussion, because a translator will translate, let's take Pavir and Volokhonsky, who's Dostoevsky I so looked forward to until I realized they were going to find the bad writer in every Russian writer. But, where you have things like, you keep phrases like, he drank up his pants, for saying he was drunk as a skunk, or what you will. I don't think drank up his pants is a particularly evocative thing in English. I think it's better to take a phrase which has a comparable force and a comparable familiarity in English, as opposed to this. And I don't see this as some sort of super-duper estrangement effect. And in fact, it struck me as I was working on this that a persistent complaint of translators, and there's a great deal of justice to it, is that translation is minimized and sort of treated as a secondary activity and not given its due, and so on and so on. But, and that, the editors are out to make people think it's not a translation. And as I told the story about Smilla's Sense of Snow or whatever, so that is sometimes true. But in fact, I think if you look at the history of translation, translation takes a lot of skill and a lot of knowledge, and like anything that human beings do that requires a certain amount of, it's almost always been true that the translations have been played up as translations. If you look at like Wyatt's translation of the penitential Psalms, not only does he translate the Psalms, he adds to it Ariosto's sort of framing narrative, which he screws with. He appropriates more than translates. But it's as if he's sort of he's making it clear that he's not just translating the Psalms, he's embedding it in this kind of larger set of problems of linguistic reception. You get to something like Dryden and Pope, they talk about the problem of translation. And so in a way, the question of normalization and the question, actually, I think the question of normalization and the question of, maybe not normalization, let's leave normalization aside for a moment. And I'll say, I was on a panel with a Spanish publisher and translator recently, and she said, we go out of our way to translate in a slightly elevated tone, a tone slightly at a slight remove from the usual Spanish tone. And I thought that was an interesting point. It's another way of saying this is a translation. It's a space to sort of imagine your way into it. It's not the verbal equivalent, it's a translation. And of course, that's very similar to the whole idea of making strange and keeping all the strange things. You're still marking the translation as this other, this other entity. So anyway, somewhat rambling answer.
Well, I have another question, because, I've dabbled with that issue quite a bit. Sometimes, and I'm totally wrong, of course, when I say this, though I believe it, so I'll be the only one to say it. It goes with my Elena Ferrante rant. I find that sometimes the best translations, the ones that I like and go back to reread, are those that have actually adapted to the target language. In other words, you take this poem. I'm thinking of the example of Cavafy, which is probably the easiest one. You take a poem in Greek that makes sense in Greek, and then you adapt it. And everybody's translated Cavafy. And then you look at what Lawrence Durrell did, which he took this poem, which he liked, and he just made it a beautiful English poem. And so that's the one you go back to, because actually that's the one that speaks to you. And sometimes it's the one that is either normalized or made into literature in the new language, which I find works for me. I don't know if it works for you.
No, I mean, as I said, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, in a certain way. I mean, and Scott Moncrief, there are obviously reasons to do a new, I mean, you wrote about this too, but do a new translation, but the translation remains very, very persuasive. I mean, I actually don't think, I think there are things, Constance Arnett is not a great writer, but the translations are still perfectly serviceable.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're all supposed to like the new translation, right?
Well, a German publisher said to me a very interesting thing about this was when War and Peace had come out in Germany and been a great, done very well for the publisher. And I said, why is that? I mean, in this country, part of the reason that people like to publish big new translations of big old books is that A, they can count on the reviewers to want to review the big old book, which they love, and to weigh in on the translation, even if they may not know much about the original. And B, they're looking for course adoptions. But the German publisher also added, and you must remember that very few of the people can actually read English novels from the 19th century anymore with much ease. So it's much easier to read a new translation of an old novel than it is to read an old novel in its own right.
Any more questions for Edwin Frank? Well then, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Edwin.
Thank you.